And joining us now on our Book Talk segment on Talk Across America, great to welcome a woman who's written a very helpful book, I'm sure, for many people that are going through similar situations. It's called Differently Wired, Raising an Exceptional Child in a Conventional World. We're joined today by Debbie Reber. She's, of course, a New York Times bestselling author, speaker, and founder of Tilt Parenting. That's a great website and a podcast and a global online community for parents raising differently wired children. And she joined us by telephone today. Debbie, good to talk with you. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Are you based still in Amsterdam?
I am. We just are hitting our 5-year anniversary of living in the Netherlands, which is kind of hard to believe, but there we are.
Yeah, I was reading through the book. I was interested in that part of it. Of course, you grew up in America, so how have you found living over there? Much of an adjustment or not too bad?
You know, it was a big adjustment initially because I really knew nothing about the Netherlands. I don't know that I'd ever even heard the Dutch language. So it was a bit of culture shock, but we kind of have fallen in love with it. It's a very livable, Amsterdam in particular, just a really nice-sized city, a lot of biking, and a high value on balance in work life and family, which I really appreciate.
And of course, before that, you worked a lot in television, right? You worked for Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, so you really kind of changed your whole atmosphere there, didn't you?
I have had so many iterations of careers, but yeah, I worked in kids' TV for a long time, and before I founded Tilt, I wrote self-help books for teenage girls.
Right.
So I like to keep things interesting, keep changing things up.
Well, this book, again, for so many parents out there, and it seems to me, Debbie, I'm not sure if I'm right about this or not, but in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, you're hearing a lot more about autism and different types of, like you said, differently wired children. I don't know if it's more prevalent today or we know more about it today, but no matter what the cause is, there are more children out there that are going through that or wired like this, right? Different brain patterns or different brain chemistry, right?
Yeah, I mean, the statistic I use in the book is 20%, but I think it's much, much higher than that. And I do think there's just a lot more awareness today than certainly when I was a student in school. Mm-hmm. Maybe I heard of dyslexia when I was a kid, but there just wasn't a lot of awareness of all the nuances of the brain and all the different ways that kids can be wired and processing differences, and ADHD wasn't really understood. And so I think with every year we're becoming more and more aware of just how varied, the brain can be.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, too, in elementary school, you occasionally heard the term, dyslexic. Some kids had trouble reading or they saw letters differently. So that's basically the term you heard then. And then later on, autism, you heard that term more. But we're not necessarily just talking about that. This can be, attention deficit disorder or Asperger's or even this, what they call giftedness. You mentioned that in the book, which can be, your brain is a little different, but you're maybe super brilliant in a certain area, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, with all these different ways of being differently wired, these are kids who process information differently and they experience the world differently. And so whether they're more emotionally intense or more sensitive to things, or they just need to process information in a way that isn't necessarily mainstream or typical, it can be really challenging because we are raising them in kind of a one-size-fits-all world, and these are not kids who fit into the box. Yeah,
that's the thing. I think every person, whether you have a differently wired brain or not, you learn things, or at least different topics differently. Then, some kids were great at math, some kids were good at reading, other kids just had a musical ability, but they learned it maybe in a different way than the teacher might be teaching it, right?
That's exactly right. And I would say, the education system, a lot of kids can make it work. But I would, think that as you said, some kids are really musically oriented and they might thrive in a different kind of a system, but some kids can make it work or fit in or conform more easily than others. And so atypical kids just have a harder time just being in a traditional classroom setting because the way that they learn is so different from a more typical path.
And you talk in the book about your own son, kind of the challenges of finding obviously the right school to put him in, because that you really didn't know what how he was learning. So it's kind of a hit or miss for a while, wasn't it? Trial and error.
Yeah, and I kept thinking there's got to be a fit here. I kept looking for the perfect school. And of course, my friends with neurotypical kids, they could send their kids to the neighborhood school and it would just work. And I kept saying, well, what are we going to do with him? There has to be a place. And it is really challenging, especially the more atypical a child is, the more individualized learning they need, and the more challenging it is to find a fit. So that's probably the biggest challenge for parents in my position, is trying to figure out what they need and then how to get it for them.
Yeah, I had the benefit of going to both public school through elementary, and then you talk about one of the schools in the book. I happened to go to one, the Waldorf School on Long Island. I think you may have talked to some of the people there. I just went there more for a situation where the high school they were going to send us wasn't in a great area, but that's another story. But it turned out to be that type of school where they were much better at working with kids that had art abilities and other abilities and everything. So I went to one of those schools and I found it different, but I found it rewarding.
Yeah, there are so many different, there's Waldorf and Montessori, and, there are lots of options. And I'm inspired to see and hopeful that there are a lot more schools also designed for, kids with learning differences and or twice exceptional kiddos. The challenge is that a lot of those are private and they're not accessible to so many families. And a lot of families end up homeschooling, which is what I've done.
Right.
And that's also not an option for everyone. So it's a challenge. The education system is something we have to really take a look at.
Let's talk a little bit about the breakdown of the book. You break it down into what you call tilts, right? Different things that people or parents can do to obviously try and help themselves, help their children. Can you give an example of one or two?
Sure. Yeah, the first tilt is one of my favorites, and it's to question everything you thought you knew about parenting. And that, just the act of doing that, right, of examining, okay, here are my set of expectations. This is what I thought it was going to look like. This is what I envisioned for his or her education and our parenting philosophy and our family. And then we have to kind of pivot and say, okay, we're on a different path here, and maybe all those assumptions we made about what he or she needs aren't really true. So it's important that we question, is this really the right path? Is this going to work? And is it so bad that we're on a different path? So that's one of my favorite tilts. I can share another one if you want me to.
Go ahead, yeah.
Another one that I really like is to become fluent in your child's language. I get asked about this one a lot.
I was going to ask you about that one. So
and again,
go ahead.
Yeah. So our child is communicating to us through everything, right? All their behavior, even the big, ugly behavior, it's communication. It's telling us they have lagging skills in this area, or, they can't do any differently right now. And so our job as parents is to get really curious instead of just saying, nope, I'm using this parenting philosophy, I'm going to march ahead, and I'm going to get this kid to get with the program. That's going to be so frustrating for parent and child alike. So we want to understand who they are and get fluent in their own language so that we can have a true two-way communication that feels good for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's broken down, like I said, 18 different tilts in the book, and very great information. I know we have limited time today, Debbie. I know you do a very successful podcast, so talk about that and also give a website out for people to get more information on the book.
Yeah, my website is tiltparenting.com, and you can download a free chapter of Differently Wired on the website. And the main resource on Tilt Parenting is my podcast. It's called the Tilt Parenting Podcast. I've got more than 100 episodes now, and I interview, parenting gurus and experts to talk about all different facets of raising atypical kids.
Great. Well, welcome also to the podcast community. I do it as well. This is also a podcast, so that's the way people are getting information out nowadays. It's a lot better and different, but I think a lot better.
Yes, I'm a consumer. I love the medium. It's awesome.
Again, the name of the book is called Differently Wired, and Deborah Reber is the name on the title, Reber, in case you're going to look it up out there. But, Debbie, pleasure talking to you. Hopefully we can do it again, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.